Good morning, it's Mr. Fouts, and today we have a history read aloud that takes place during the time of the American Revolutionary War, and it's called They Called Her Molly Pitcher by Anne Rockwell and illustrated by Cynthia von Bueller. So that's nice. On the inside cover it has some words from the Declaration of Independence. A picture of the American flag there. Okay. In 1777, a barber named William Hayes closed up shop and set off for Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. He wouldn't be powdering any wigs or shaving whiskers for a while. Most of his customers had gone to fight in the War of Independence, which had broken out 2 years earlier between the North American colonists and the King of England. William wanted to do his part against that pig-headed king who was denying American colonists the citizens' rights they would have had in England. So now he was going to be a soldier too. When he went off to join General George Washington's colonial army at Valley Forge, his young wife Mary, nicknamed Molly, went with him. No one ever said she was pretty, but she was strong, hard-working, and good-natured. There's a lot of author commentary in here. Do you like how they have it where there's picture on one side and text on the other, or do you wish it was more integrated? Let me know what you think. General George Washington was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He and other officers, plus a bedraggled army of about 12,000 men and boys, were camped at Valley Forge just before Christmas of 1777. Snow lay deep on the ground, and Washington's troops had run out of everything they needed to keep on fighting. Washington begged the Second Continental Congress for food and supplies, but none came. It was so cold that soldiers had to stand on their hats in the snow to keep their feet from freezing. Their shoes had holes in them from tramping over miles of rough and stony ground. They had no blankets or warm clothes. They didn't have enough to eat. Their camp was a filthy mess. Many of them were very sick. Every day, more and more soldiers deserted. Others died. Molly and other women who'd followed husbands, sons, fathers, and brothers to Valley Forge did what they could to help. They cooked and cleaned, washed and mended clothes, and nursed the sick. But no matter what they did, more soldiers died each day. Things began to look up when the Second Continental Congress finally sent supplies. George Washington began planning to go to battle again. I wonder if that's General von Steuben. Hey, look at that, it is. In late February, a German-speaking man arrived at Valley Forge. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Augustus von Steuben, and he claimed to be a baron from Prussia. He also said that he'd been an officer in the army of his king, Frederick the Great. He bragged that he could turn Washington's ragtag army into a fine fighting force, as fine as those in his native Prussia, which he insisted were far better than those of the King of England. Washington's men had been fighting the way they hunted deer or bear. They'd sneak up from behind and catch the enemy off guard. They were good at this guerrilla warfare, for they knew secret hiding places in caves and paths through woods and fields that the British didn't. But they didn't know how to fight on an open battlefield against a superbly trained, well-equipped professional army, and Washington knew that that was what they'd soon face. The King of England had sent his finest soldiers across the sea to put down the revolution, and more were on their way. Washington knew how to plan and carry out surprise attacks. That's why the British called him that wily old fox. But he didn't see how the men and boys in his army could learn in less than 2 months what England's professional soldiers had spent most of their lives learning. It was impossible. Still, he told Baron von Steuben to do the best he could. Sorry, it's a little bit jittery. I'm doing the best I can. Somehow von Steuben did the impossible, and without speaking a word of English. He taught the soldiers to face straight ahead when marching in file, rifles to their shoulders. He taught them to advance against the enemy in proper formation, for that is the way their enemies fought. He even taught the soldiers to keep their camp clean and neat, as all military camps were supposed to be. And when this happened, fewer members of the army became sick. Molly watched and listened. and didn't forget a bit of what she saw and heard. When they left Valley Forge late in the spring of 1778, the Continental Army was ready to fight. Its soldiers marched in single or double file, eyes straight ahead, muskets at their shoulders. Most of them, including George Washington, said goodbye to the women who'd joined them at Valley Forge, but William Hayes didn't. When he marched toward the colony of New Jersey, his wife followed. Molly figured she'd find ways to make herself useful. She always had. She carried few possessions, but among them was a dented pewter pitcher that would prove to be one of America's greatest assets. I wonder how. I wonder how she's going to figure into the action of this war. At the end of June, a scout brought news. A large number of British soldiers, led by Sir Henry Clinton, were gathered at Monmouth Courthouse near the New Jersey shore. The fight everyone had been preparing for was coming very soon. Washington ordered General Charles Lee to lead an advanced guard of 5,000 soldiers to attack the British. He'd send in a rear guard of more men soon after the fighting was underway. William Hayes was among Lee's advanced guard marching to battle. As she always had, Molly followed. Winter at Valley Forge had been bitter cold, but June of 1778 in New Jersey was hotter than anyone could remember. It was just after sunrise when American soldiers fired on the British near Monmouth Courthouse. Molly could see that the day was going to be a scorcher. Heat and humidity were already shimmering up from the ground. She decided what her job would be that day. She'd spotted a green and mossy place where a spring gushed up. She ran and filled her pitcher with cold water. She raced back to the battlefield, dodging cannon and musket fire, carrying her pitcher full of water for any American soldier who needed a drink. The Americans knew all about such hot and humid summer days. They knew that they had to keep cool any way they could. They ignored what Baron von Steuben had taught them about looking neat and military at all times. They stripped off coats, belts, wigs, hats, boots, shoes, and stockings, and tossed them onto the grass. Part of me thinks that if giving them water is all that she did, she wouldn't be remembered as well as she has enough to have a book written about her, so she must have done something else. I wonder what that was. That'd be kind of scary to be in the middle of a battle and all you have is a pitcher of water. Smoke, noise, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Molly paid no attention. All morning she ran back and forth from battlefield to spring, spring to battlefield, bringing water to men who'd collapsed in the heat. Over and over she heard the urgent cry of, "Molly! Pitcher!" Still more British soldiers, under orders from Lord Cornwallis, marched toward Monmouth Courthouse. The men formed a line of scarlet like a winding river of blood. They were a magnificent and terrifying sight, but their fine uniforms weren't what they should have been wearing in the sun that blazed down on them. Each man wore a tall black fur hat, a scarlet coat of thick warm wool, a wide and shining black belt that held a sharp sword, a white waistcoat, and matching woolen pants with knee-high, brightly polished black boots. Each marched with his eyes straight ahead, a musket on his shoulder, a knapsack full of heavy lead balls of ammunition on his back. They moved to the stirring music of war. Drums were beating, fifes were playing, trumpets were sounding. The soldiers started dropping as the sun rose higher. These Englishmen had never felt such heat in their home across the sea. It was almost 100 degrees in New Jersey that day. Men grew faint and dizzy and fell to the ground, but their companions kept on marching. They never stopped or broke step, even when one man or more collapsed. 56 British soldiers died of heat stroke that day. That didn't stop them, though. All morning, more and more scarlet coats marched onto the field. Many American soldiers panicked at the sight of so many. General Lee couldn't maintain order. His soldiers forgot all about fighting in the disciplined ways Baron von Steuben had taught them. Instead, they ran in terror this way and that, hiding in ditches, up in apple trees, beneath hedges. Ooh, the picture's on the right-hand side this time. Look at that, loading up the cannon. General Lee was sure there'd be a massacre of his troops before morning turned to noon. He gave orders to retreat. Molly saw that some of the men, including William, disobeyed the order and kept on fighting. The sun was growing hotter. As long as any member of the Continental Army needed water to drink, Molly Hayes wasn't going anywhere. On one of her trips to the spring, she stumbled over the body of an American soldier. She assumed he was dead until she heard him moan. The British were advancing quickly, guns aimed straight at their foes. Molly knew she could run to safety, but the wounded man couldn't walk, let alone run. He lay directly in the line of fire and would surely be killed if he stayed there. He was a good-sized fellow, but Molly wasted no time wondering how she'd do what she had to. She picked the man up, slung him over her shoulder, and ran to a clump of bushes away from the gunfire. She laid him down there on the grass and shade. She ran back toward the spring and past the cannon William was firing just in time to see a ball from a British musket hit him. William fell to the ground. She examined her husband's wound and saw that he wouldn't die from it, but he couldn't fire his cannon. Someone had to. Molly grabbed the long ramrod, plunged it into the barrel of the cannon, and fired it off. She kept on firing. And I guess that's why they brought in the detail previously about her listening to Baron von Steuben's orders, so that she knew how to do that. Ooh, a whole page of nothing but picture. That kind of gives you a sense of how chaotic battle can be. It's hard to see where all the British are and where all the colonists are. I mean, the uniforms help a little bit, but that smoke makes it challenging. Now look at that. A ball fired low from a British musket came whizzing straight toward Molly. She quickly spread her legs wide. The musket ball passed between them. It never touched her, but her skirt and petticoat were ripped and became a good deal shorter than they had been. She muttered that it could have been worse and went back to firing the cannon. Soon General Washington galloped onto the field riding Nelson, his fine horse, who never shied at the noise of gun and cannons, no matter how close they were. Washington carried the flag of Commander-in-Chief, 13 stars and a circle on a field of blue silk. The flag fluttered and flew above the smoke of battle. It wasn't as bright as the scarlet coats the British soldiers wore, but to everyone who stayed on to fight, it was a cheering and glorious sight. For the rest of that hot and steamy day, the Continental Army fought the way Baron von Steuben had taught it to. George Washington saw to that. As he galloped over to the battlefield, shouting orders and spurring his men on, he was amazed to catch a glimpse of a woman. She was blurred by the smoke that surrounded her. Her face was smudged with gunpowder and sweat, but George Washington saw her take a deep breath, then run and shove the long ramrod into the big gun with as much force as possible. The cannon boomed, the explosion shook the ground, but the woman paid no attention. She just got ready to fire the cannon again. When the sun set, the fighting stopped. Neither side could go on in darkness. Exhausted British and American soldiers put down their guns and tended to their dead and wounded. Late that night, they sat down to eat and rest, to prepare themselves for another day of fighting. Wonder if they were close together. Kind of interesting to think about soldiers taking a break when they aren't that far apart because they can't see at night. Oh, that's cool. That same night, General Washington asked some of his officers about the woman he'd seen firing a cannon. He listened to what they said about how she'd carried water through the gunfire to the soldiers all that morning. Washington ordered that the woman be brought before him. He told her she'd been as brave in battle as any man he'd ever heard of. He decided that she'd earned the rank of sergeant in the Continental Army. As she listened to what the tall, strong general said, Molly Hayes had never felt so proud in her life. No man who heard General Washington speak to her that night doubted that Molly had earned her rank. As the news spread through the troops, no soldier sneered at the thought of a woman being a sergeant in his army, even though no one present had ever heard of such a thing. That night, Sergeant Molly Hayes lay down on the grass at the edge of the field beside William and the rest of the soldiers of the Continental Army. Long after the stars filled the sky, General George Washington spread his cape over the grass, tied Nelson to a tree, and lay down with his weary soldiers. As he lay gazing up at the stars, planning his strategy for the next day's battle, fires danced on the hill across the field where the British were camped. The voices of many men carried through the night. Sentries marched back and forth, keeping their endless watch. It was very late before everything was quiet, except for the chorus of frogs singing in the nearby swamp. Molly and the other American soldiers rose before the sun. They'd had some sleep and were ready to fight again. Many believed they could win. But they didn't fight the British that day. No scarlet-coated soldiers marched onto the field. They'd gone away. Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis had ordered a retreat. They didn't want their men to fight that wily old fox again this morning. They were afraid they'd lose. Washington's Continental Army didn't fight like farmers, as the British leaders had been sure they would. They fought like soldiers, and one of those soldiers was a woman. No one knows if Sergeant Molly Hayes took part in any of the battles that followed. By the time the British surrendered and the war ended in 1783, she and William had gone home to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Molly went back to the same work she'd done before the war, doing laundry, cleaning houses, and taking care of children. The only fault her employers ever found with her was that she swore like a soldier. That's neat. In 1789, George Washington was elected the first president of a new country, the United States of America. No longer would the American people have to obey a faraway king. They'd won the battle to become a free and independent nation. And one of the people who helped win this freedom was Molly Hayes. Soldiers who fought at the Battle of Monmouth never forgot her. They told their children and grandchildren about the brave woman who'd been in the battle with them. They told how she'd run through gunfire again and again that hot day to bring them the drink of cool and refreshing water that kept them fighting. They called her Molly Pitcher, and that's the name we remember her by, but she never called herself that. As long as she lived, she asked everyone to call her Sergeant Molly. It's cool. So we've got a little map of the battlefield. And there's an author's note there about how she got interested in the story of Molly Pitcher and then wanted to go and research what was fact and what was fiction, which is always a great part of being a historical nonfiction author, is getting to go back and do the research. So feel free to pause the video if you want to read that. And we've got a timeline of events that led to the Revolutionary War and also events that happened during the war itself. And then we've got the dedication page, and it closes. Oh, I wonder if this is from the Constitution. No, promote the general warfare. This is from the, no, it is the preamble to the Constitution. I wonder why it's titled 1791. Maybe it was when it was voted on. I don't know. At any rate, we've reached the end of the story. Thank you so much for joining me on this reading journey. Look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye.